Good evening and welcome to Washington Week. I'm Vivian Salama in tonight for Jeffrey Goldberg. It is possible the Justice Department had just stumbled repeatedly when it comes to its handling of the Epstein files. But after a year of overpromising and under-delivering, backpedaling, and some flip-flopping, the Justice Department was forced by law to release most of its files related to the late sex offender. But even that didn't go as it should have. The DOJ missed the deadline to make public all the documents in its possession. And in fairness, there are millions. But still, it was striking when it emerged this week that files containing allegations against President Trump were withheld from the public. There's a lot to sort through, and luckily we have an expert panel to walk us through this and the ensuing political fallout. Andrew Desiderio is a senior congressional reporter at Punchbowl News. My colleague, Sarah Fitzpatrick, is a staff writer at The Atlantic. Stephen Hayes is the editor of The Dispatch. And Tarini Parti is a national politics reporter at The Wall Street Journal. It's so great to see you all. Sarah, I'm going to start with you because there's probably no one who has covered this more closely and for as long as you have. Just walk us through, give us an overview of how we got to this moment with regards to the government's handling of the Epstein files and where we stand on just the release of those files.
So I think the key thing to remember about the Epstein story is that it is a case that has been mishandled for decades. But the reason that we're hearing about this now and why it's exploding into public view is because for the first time, Republicans in Congress and Democrats in Congress were willing to openly defy their leadership and call for the release of these files. That has never been done before, and I think that really is changing the political landscape in ways that we are still just starting to learn. And
obviously, there's been a big focus, Tarini, on how the DOJ has handled this under Attorney General Pam Bondi specifically. What do we know about what documents they've released, what documents they've withheld, and their position overall on this issue?
The person who's been most frustrated by DOJ's handling is the president himself. He's been so frustrated with Pam Bondi. She's been on thin ice with him. And the source of his frustration has been the sort of back and forth and the backpedaling that we mentioned. And we reported, months ago that his name has been in the files. And now we've learned that DOJ actually, removed some of these files. And so this back and forth has really sort of frustrated him. We've also seen that they've tried to change their story, including a cabinet official this week who Howard Lutnick had initially said, he had cut ties with Epstein when he learned of his behavior, but then he had to backtrack. So the president is so frustrated with these constant back and forths. He wants the story to go away, is the bottom line. And DOJ continually mishandling, releasing information, taking it back is not really helping.
But do they acknowledge that there are files that exist referencing President Trump that they haven't released?
We know that there are files with his name in it that we've reported exist. They just have gone back and forth in terms of releasing his name in some files and then removing them.
Stephen, a lot of this was driven initially by Republicans who were calling for transparency. Take us behind that. What was inspiring that kind of push among Republicans?
Well, I mean, if you go long before President Trump's re-election, you had Republicans on the campaign trail. This was popular among sort of the right-wing podcasting set, making claims about the Epstein files and claiming that they were going to get Democrats. I mean, most of this came from a partisan place, not surprising given where we are in the country. But what's been so striking is how many of those very same Republicans who were calling for the release of the files and promised to get to the bottom of them are now saying things that are just the opposite. I mean, you're talking about Pam Bondi, Dan Bongino, who's the number 2 at the FBI, made this, one of the things he talked about incessantly. And then when he came in, he was less interested in what was there. I think because they learned that Donald Trump's name was in these files quite a lot, and that the things that we'd heard and seen from Donald Trump in public raised more questions about why he was in the files than they were in.
Not just President Trump. We're talking several members of the cabinet. Tarini just mentioned Commerce Secretary Lutnick, who we're going to get to in a few minutes, but even Trump aide Steve Bannon,
Yeah.
who's repeatedly been in there, Elon Musk. This used to energize the base, and now it's uncertain. It's unclear where the base stands on this because it's been so divisive.
Yeah, you know, there was this moment back in February of 2025. The White House made this big scene of inviting these conservative right-wing influencers to the White House, and they gave them these binders, white binders, that said the Epstein files phase 1, and said, you know, this is sort of a down payment on things to come. We plan on being very transparent. You're going to learn a lot from what's in these files that we're giving you right now. And the people who had been agitating for the release of more files looked at what they were given and said, this is old, this is out. And I think that was a moment when people who had trusted Donald Trump and who had looked to capitalize on this as something with which they could attack Democrats said, wait a second, this is bogus what they're giving us now.
Obviously, we want to mention all these names that we're talking about. Just because they're mentioned in the files doesn't mean that there's criminal wrongdoing.
Right.
So, Andrew, one of the big developments this week was that both Hillary and Bill Clinton testified for the House Oversight Committee. What do we know about their testimony, and how did we get to this moment where the Clintons were sitting with them to talk about what they know?
Well, to Steve's point, you know, Trump has been trying to position himself as the Epstein whistleblower, for lack of a better phrase, right? And what we've seen is Republicans in Congress, they control the House, they control the Senate. Of course, in the House of Representatives, it's a more Trumpy bunch, if you will, trying to sort of deflect a little bit from the president in this respect and go after the Clintons. Now, there are a lot of Democrats in the House, too, particularly younger Democrats, who have less allegiance or practically no allegiance to the Clintons at all and didn't mind voting to actually hold them in contempt of Congress for originally not agreeing to testify. But what we saw over the last 2 days when both Hillary and Bill Clinton testified, particularly yesterday during Hillary Clinton's testimony behind closed doors, it appeared that Republicans were not treating it with that much seriousness. I mean, Congresswoman Lauren Boebert took a photo from inside the room and leaked it to a conservative provocateur who then published it online. They had to stop the deposition after that happened. You know, Hillary Clinton was asked apparently about the conspiracy theories from 2016, like Pizzagate and all that stuff. I mean, it just was not a sort of a serious exercise. And what we're seeing now is more and more—
There's that photo that you mentioned.
Right. What we're seeing now is more and more Republicans come out and say that, you know, some members of President Trump's administration, like Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, should testify as well. With Secretary Lutnick in particular, the issue is that he wasn't very forthright about when exactly he cut off ties with Jeffrey Epstein. He initially said it was sooner than it actually was, and then the files came out, and we saw that there was communication many, many years after he had said that they had stopped having any sort of relationship.
Yeah, Sarah, you know, you have a great piece out today, and also, you know, I have the advantage of sitting you're right over my shoulder, so we can talk about a lot of this stuff during the day. And one of the things that you've mentioned in passing is that for years, Democrats didn't pursue the release of these files, in part because of that Clinton link. Can you talk a little bit about that and how it, as your story talks about, it became a bipartisan issue?
Absolutely. This is one of the things that I find most fascinating about this story, because all of these files, millions of these files, could have been released at any point by a Biden Justice Department, by the first Trump administration. I mean, these have been there for a very long time. But the reason that this is coming out now, I think, is because party leadership had been very, very clear to the rank and file: do not pursue this. In part, I think, out of concern about donors, about the Clintons, also for the fact that it was viewed as a distraction versus things like healthcare. But now I think what we saw is younger Democrats, to your point, realize that this is a transparency issue. This is a trust in government issue. And as Kana says in the piece, the only way that I'm ever going to get other things passed is if people believe in government. One of the things that's in my piece is that the Clintons were actively lobbying, calling around on Capitol Hill to Democrats to try and prevent this vote and to kind of influence how this was being done. And I think that really does not, it just hits the wrong way with Democrats that are already feeling very jaded given what happened with allegations of a cover-up about Biden's health and Harris's loss.
Right.
You know, there's just so much less confidence in the kind of the elder generation. and a real belief that voters want transparency, and that is the winning issue.
It is generational, too, because Nancy Pelosi was the one actually behind closed doors admonishing those younger Democrats for even entertaining the idea of voting to hold the Clintons in contempt of Congress. And when I talk to senators, you know, when they come back from a recess, for example, they're home in their states and they come back to Capitol Hill, say, you know, held events, what are people, you know, what's on people's minds, right? We're here in this bubble in Washington. You know, what are people telling you when you're back home? The intensity of this issue among the public, right? Democrats, Republicans alike, senators in both parties always say to me, people are pressing me on the Epstein files every single day, every single event I go to, every event I'm at, I get a question about this.
So it's a thing voters care about.
Right. The public intensity here, I think, should not be lost on anyone.
I think even the Democrats who are reluctant to make this an issue, what I've been told by some of them is that they can kind of package it into the broader midterm issue, which is Trump has failed on delivering his promises. So, you know, you can talk about grocery prices or the economy, but Epstein files is also another thing, because it was a big promise to the base that he clearly has not fully delivered on. So they can kind of wrap it up into one package.